We're on Chapter 18, the persuasive speech. My goals or objectives for you in this chapter are to define the purpose or the aim of persuasive speaking, to be able to paraphrase the principles of persuasive speaking, especially those that I'm going to focus on in this lecture and in class, to define and then distinguish between logical or logos, emotional or pathos, and credibility or ethos appeals, which are each very important in persuasive speaking. And then also to name and describe the purpose of each step in Monroe's motivated sequence. And finally, to name and describe several of the fallacies in reasoning. So the whole purpose of your persuasive speech is you are trying to influence the attitudes, beliefs, and or behaviors of other people. An attitude is a tendency to behave in a certain way. A belief is a conviction in the existence or reality of something or the truth of some assertion. A value is how people feel about something, whether it's good or bad, ethical or unethical, just or unjust. And behavior is an observable action. The principles of persuasive speaking are to know your goals, and your thesis statement of your persuasive speech will be very important in this regard because you want to have a specific goal in your speech. You want to focus on and identify with your audience, and there are some others on this list that we'll be focusing quite a bit more attention on. Your persuasive speech will focus on one or more of these goals. And you can focus on more than one, but you will focus on at least one of these. You want to be able to identify with your audience. You want them to identify with you. So you want to build up some similarities between you and them. You want to build a rapport from the beginning. You certainly don't want to ask the audience to do anything that you have not done. So you want to build a certain type of kinship and certainly let them know that you are like them in whatever ways you can. You may recall the law of selective exposure as we talked about it in Chapter 3. It states that we as individuals are more apt to pay attention or to tune in or to listen to those who reinforce our own beliefs and attitudes. This is really important to remember when you're trying to persuade your audience. We know that listeners actively seek out information that supports what they already believe, or what they already do, or what they already value. Conversely, listeners actively avoid information that contradicts what they currently believe or do, or their values. So knowing this is very important when you're trying to convince your audience of something. Where would you want to state your thesis if you think your audience may not agree with you? Think about this for a moment. Knowing that we are susceptible to the selective exposure phenomenon, where do you think you'd want to state your thesis? Well, probably later in your speech after you've presented some of your case. Here's another principle that's important to remember when you're trying to convince someone or persuade someone. Ask for reasonable amounts of change, because really the truth is, in general, we change very gradually in our beliefs and our values and our behaviors. So we can usually only expect a small degree of change, and it takes a long period of time, but we can help get that started. The motivational sequence is a really great model for a persuasive speech. It really simplifies the whole process, and this is the method that we're going to use for your persuasive speech in this class. There are 5 steps in the motivational sequence, and as long as you clearly fulfill each of those 5 steps, you should be in good shape. We'll be talking more about motivational sequence and how to fulfill each of these steps in class, and you'll probably be critiquing some videos of persuasive speeches using this method. So let's just briefly look at these 5 steps. The first, of course, is to get the audience's attention, and this was important in your informational speech as well. You have to get their attention, you have to get their interest. The second step is to demonstrate that an actual need exists. There's a need for them to change an attitude, change a value, change a belief, change a behavior. You have to demonstrate that in some way in your speech. The third step is, how can the need be satisfied by doing or believing what you are telling them to do? How is this going to affect their life, the world, etc.? The fourth step is for you to help them visualize what will happen, what will change if they do start to believe or behave or have an attitude or a value that is in line in what you're proposing for them. So that's visualization. And the final step, and this would probably be in your conclusion, is to urge them to take action. Now, this may be a behavior, or it may be take action in the way they see the world or see something, or their attitude or their belief. I've given you a more detailed description here of what each of the 5 steps in the motivated sequence would entail, and also some cautions to observe. So this is a good chart for you to study as you're creating your persuasive speech. Let's look at credibility, logic, and the appeal to the emotions. Now, the most effective persuasive arguments will often use all 3 of these to some extent. Let's look at these 3 one by one, and these are in no particular order of importance. But let's first look at the use of emotional appeals. And this is appealing to feelings, to needs, to desires, to wants, pathos. Now, if we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and in your JetNet, your slides that you can print off on JetNet, I've included a chart of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And they start, basically what this recognizes is that each of us as individuals needs, first of all, the very basic physiological things to survive: food, water, air. And then it goes up, the next one I believe is shelter. And it goes up through self-esteem all the way to the top. The top, the very highest of the needs, when we have everything else covered, is our self-actualization, our feeling of fulfillment and being able to question and think and ponder the meaning of life, that kind of thing. So you want to meet people where they're at if you're going to use emotional appeals. I'll give you an extreme, a radical example. If your audience was going to be homeless folks who weren't sure where their next meal was coming from, you probably wouldn't capture them, and they probably wouldn't relate to a talk about finding meaning in life, finding a career that gives you meaning in life. They're too worried about their next meal and having a roof over their head. So that's an extreme example, but just something to take into consideration if you're going to use emotional appeals. Using logical appeals. Now, it's been shown that listeners are more likely to remain persuaded if you use logical appeals to convince them, and they will be more likely to resist counter arguments in the future. So logical appeals are valuable. There are many fallacies in reasoning that we'll talk about a bit at the end of this lecture and are described in detail in the book. And knowing those fallacies in reasoning will help you stay away from them when you're trying to convince folks. You want to stay away from those fallacies in reasoning. And you also, knowing what they are, will help ensure that you don't fall prey to other people who are trying to convince you using those fallacies in reasoning. So logical appeals are quite important. Credibility appeals. There are three types of credibility: competence, character, and charisma. Competence refers to the speaker's credibility, the presenter's credibility on this topic. Your audience may judge by your reputation as it is known, how thoroughly they believe you researched or how thoroughly you looked into what you're saying. Your competence may be judged by what they know of you from the past. Now, in a class like this, we don't know much about our fellow speakers' pasts in most cases. So it's really important to include citation of your research sources that are believable for people and appear credible to them, because that's really what you have to rely on in this class for the most part, the credibility of your sources. Character. Fairness, concern for audience. Charisma, judged by enthusiasm and commitment. So you can display all three of these to some extent in your presentation. Here are some of the fallacies in reasoning that you need to be aware of so that you don't use them and so that you recognize them in another's persuasive speeches. So anecdotal evidence is a story, personal experience. You can use these, but to rely on them to prove your point is going to be probably going to be blown apart by someone at some point. Anecdotal evidence, as we're speaking of here, is things like, well, no one I know has ever been in an accident when they were a teenager, so I don't know why teens have to pay more for car insurance. That kind of thing. You can't rely entirely on your personal experience to prove a point. Appeal to tradition argues against change. Basically, it states, well, it's never been done that way, so why should it be done that way now? Jumping on the bandwagon. Oh, everyone's doing it. All the best people are doing it. The Kardashians are doing it. Everyone's doing this, so why don't you do it? Testimonial approach often uses celebrity endorsement. Commercials for products, ads for products do this all the time because they still hold a certain amount of weight with some people, celebrity endorsements. But it's not really a long-term best solution to convincing your audience of something. So there's a few of the fallacies in reasoning to be aware of.